Good morning and welcome, everybody, to Shelburne Museum. My name is Tom Denenberg, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to the Stiller Auditorium at Shelburne Museum in our new Pizzigalli Center for Art and Education. We have just celebrated the one-year anniversary of this building. As I came in, one of our participants today, one of our guests said, well, you're certainly putting this building to good use. And I think we clearly are with programs like celebrating, programs like the American Eye, exploring and celebrating American painting. I noticed at the end of our case statement for constructing this building, there was a line that said something like, once the new Pizzigalli building is up and open for business, we will be able to reclaim the web gallery down the hill, which we had been using for temporary exhibition space for about 13 or 14 years, and reinstall our American painting collection. And that's a very simple sentence or two, and it turned into probably a 3-year project for our conservators and consulting painting conservators, and a number of fellows and interns and curators, and yours truly, in thinking about our American paintings collection at Shelburne Museum, because this is a relatively unappreciated and little-known collection. It has been literally out of sight in storage for well over a decade, and it is a wonderful, wonderful collection. There are 540 American paintings at Shelburne Museum. They were gathered very quickly in the late 1950s by our founder, Electra Havemeyer-Webb, and they play a very important play a very important part in our understanding of the creation of a canon of American painting in the 1950s. This is the moment just as Americans are beginning to pay attention to 19th century painting, to 19th century visual culture, and we are rediscovering and rehabilitating so many different artists in this time period, 1940s and 1950s. Major names from the 19th century who had been forgotten in the early 20th century come roaring back into popular consciousness through a series of important exhibitions in New York City in the 1940s and 50s. And it is really such a clear roadmap for our collection, those exhibitions and those early publications by very storied scholars of that era. So our collection becomes something of a time capsule, if you will, for this flowering of interest in American art in the 1950s. And I'm so pleased that last spring we were able to reopen the web gallery with state-of-the-art lighting and new building management systems and new walls and ceilings and new finish, and it looks wonderful. And we will eventually find our way down the hill to look at the collection in the flesh. But for the majority of the day, it is my very, very great pleasure to welcome dear colleagues and dear friends to Shelburne Museum who are going to help us understand the place of our collection in the larger world of American art, both in the 1950s and 60s and today, and the role of these painters in the creation of an American eye, an American vision, and American identity. I would like to thank so many of you who are here today who participated in the campaign to reinstall that American collection down the hill. I would like to thank so many of you who participated in the campaign to build this wonderful structure, which allowed us to reclaim the web gallery and to reinstall that collection. And we have, I think, about half of our board of trustees here with us. We're just finishing up our board meeting, our fall board meeting, and so it is a wonderful, wonderful thing that we all get to learn together about the collection, and I want to thank them for their leadership. We always say they are perhaps our most important volunteers at Shelburne Museum, and they do such a wonderful, wonderful job here. And I do want to thank Carol Troyen, Mark Simpson, and Ellery Fouch for coming today. I also, first and foremost, want to thank Karen Peterson and her staff. They do such a wonderful job organizing these symposia. This is the, thank you. This is the third such symposia that we've done, and we're so pleased with the response to each. We looked at collecting, we looked at the history of our landscape and gardens, and now we're looking at the American paintings. So we have a wonderful series here, and we know that people will increasingly get used to the idea of the Shelburne Museum Symposia as being a place where cutting-edge ideas are shared in Greater Burlington. It is my very, very great pleasure to introduce Carol Troyen, who will be our first speaker today. Carol is the Kristin and Roger Servison Curator Emerita of American Paintings at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. She's a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Yale University, and she also earned her Ph.D. at Yale. While at the Museum of Fine Arts, she helped organize many exhibitions which were landmark studies in our field, including Charles Sheeler, Paintings and Drawings, Awash in Color, Homer, Sargent, and the Great American Watercolor, John Singleton, Copley in America, and John Singer Sargent. Her exhibition of the works of Edward Hopper was seen at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, the National Gallery of Art, Washington, D.C., and the Art Institute of Chicago in 2007 and 2008. She has lectured at museums across the country and has served as the acting chief curator at the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford, Connecticut. She is now an independent scholar, I would argue busier than ever, probably. Among her current projects are a catalog essay for the Philadelphia Museum of Art's forthcoming American Still Life exhibition. I would like to point out Shelburne Museum is lending to that exhibition, and an essay on Charles Sheeler's late works. And very personally, I would like to say that 24 years ago, probably this month, yeah, I probably shouldn't put a date on that, I wandered into, pardon? Just did. Where are we going with this? I wandered into Carol's office as a graduate student, full of ideas about her paintings. And I was interested in Child Hassam early on in graduate school and wandered over. And I still often credit Carol and Ted Stevens and Erica Hirschler for not kicking me out of their office because they were so sort of supportive and collegial to a first semester graduate student who wanted to come over and paw through their files. And it was really a remarkable sort of day that I still remember and perhaps launched my longtime interest in American painting. So please join me in welcoming Carol Troyen to Shelburne Museum.
What Tom didn't mention was that I was 17 at the time. Thank you, Tom. That was really very, oh, this is yours. Mine's the one with the vodka in it. It's really nice to be here. It's nice to see an institution that I've known through occasional visits looking so well. Walked through the web gallery yesterday and said, wow, that picture looks good. Wow, I don't remember it looking just that spiffy. So kudos to all of you for supporting the good work that goes on here. I will say, though, Tom, it's time to pick those cabbages. Now, let's see if I can figure out how to start this. There's the slideshow. Yes, from the beginning. This is a very good machine. I thought today that I'd talk about politics, which in the state I come from is a blood sport, and we are in the midst of yet another bloody campaign, and take you back in time to not the first time, but one of the most critical times that Massachusetts and Boston was engaged in the blood sport of politics, but we're going to do it through paintings. Oops, did I do that wrong? Go. As far as I know, John Singleton Copley, whom you see there, never ventured a political opinion. He couldn't afford to because he counted among his clients equal numbers of New England's most prominent Whigs and Tories, patriots and loyalists. Wealthy landowners who rallied under the Patriot banner, men like Moses Gill, hired Copley. So did prosperous importers like Isaac Royal, who was a Tory, and his business virtually required support of the Loyalist position. Copley's personal connections suggest that he was a Tory too. He married into a prominent Loyalist family, but, clever guy, he maintained cordial relationships with numerous patriots, including Paul Revere, and you'll see them together later on. Copley seldom allowed politics to enter into his art in any obvious way. However, as the revolution drew near, certain of Copley's portraits took on political importance. Most of his images of New Englanders are displays of wealth that express their social aspirations rather than their political affiliations. Yet some of his paintings reveal his sitters' attitudes about compelling issues of the day. Copley was 18th century America's greatest portrait painter. He was self-taught, incredibly ambitious, extraordinarily talented, and extremely canny about managing his career. He began that career in a period of relative political calm and economic prosperity. Otherwise, his beginnings were rather unpromising. His immigrant parents ran a tobacco shop on Long Wharf, which was then a rather rough and tumble part of town. Copley's father died when he was when he was about 7. When he was 10, his mother remarried, a marriage that advanced her several steps up the social ladder and provided him with a great professional start. His stepfather, Peter Pelham, was an artist and engraver, but also a dancing master and an instructor in manners and deportment. Through Pelham, Copley learned about artistic materials and techniques. He met other artists, including John Smibert, whose print collection was critical to his artistic education. But most important was Pelham's work as an instructor in deportment, which gave Copley entree to the class of people who would become his clients, and he learned how to make conversation with them while painting their portraits. By the time he was 14, Copley had embarked on a disciplined program of self-education. He read books, he corresponded with European artists, he gave himself art lessons. On the left is a page from his anatomical sketchbook, which he used to teach himself anatomy. And he practiced on his relatives. The fellow with a pink curtain behind him is his stepbrother Charles, who was a schoolmaster and, as you can see, something of a snappy dresser. The portrait foreshadows signature elements of Copley's style, his use of props to identify his sitters' occupations, his ability to render elegant fabric and furniture convincingly, and in so doing, to advertise his sitters' wealth and sense of style. Copley's first commission came in 1753. He was barely 16 when he was hired to paint Mrs. Mann, the local baker's wife. He based her pose on an engraved portrait of Princess Anne. There you see her on the left, a comparison that seems kind of unlikely, maybe even a little ludicrous to us. But Mrs. Mann undoubtedly loved the promotion that Copley gave her, a Boston baker's daughter being treated like British royalty. By 1758, Copley was 20. The tide in the endless war with France was turning in favor of Britain. The battles were fought far from Boston, and so the city enjoyed many of the benefits and few of the privations of the conflict. Copley's portraits were designed to advertise the town's prosperity and to underscore the colonists' affiliation with Britain. Among the first of Copley's high-tone clients was Theodore Atkinson, son of the wealthiest man in New Hampshire. In 1758, Atkinson celebrated his graduation from Harvard and his coming into his inheritance with this dashing portrait. He was ranked first in his class at Harvard, a ranking which was based not on grades, but on net worth. The portrait was designed to show off his status and to connect Atkinson with the style and prestige of English gentry. He wears a formal red velvet suit, an elegant white silk waistcoat embroidered in silver, an expensive and imported outfit that displays English needlework at its finest. His casual, cross-legged stance echoes British portraits of aristocratic gentlemen at their ease. Such portraits were well known in the colonies through prints. Equally well known were English manuals of deportment, which illustrated poses and gestures like Atkinson's, and you see one here, as expressions of genteel behavior. So, if nothing else, Atkinson was assured that his elite friends would recognize and understand the body language of his portrait. Over the next few years, we see more and more of these tokens of Anglophilia in Copley's portraits. Not only did his sitters wear the finest English clothing, but they also assumed poses and appeared in settings that were derived from English prints. Associations with British aristocracy were seen as flattering. We were British. They weren't politically charged as they'd become. So here's an example. In 1861, Copley painted Hannah Quincy, Mrs. Samuel Quincy, in a sensuous and exotic dress. It has a low square bodice, a blue sash, a satin stomacher, and sleeves pulled back with gold chains. The plumed hat adds another level of flirtatiousness. Now, Copley didn't take that dress from anything in Mrs. Quincy's closet, but rather from a portrait, a very famous one, by Rubens, which is there on the right. Now, the Rubens had recently entered a prominent British collection and set off a frenzy among English upper-class women for dressing up in 17th century costume. They did this at fancy dress balls, and they had their portrait painted in such attire. Now, here on the right is a print, after such an English portrait. Now, in Boston, no one wore such dresses, but because of prints like these, they knew about them. Copley had an unerring sense of what was and what would be fashionable, and this instinct, too, was a key ingredient of his success. He was also extremely clever in matching his fashions to his sitters. In this case, a 17th century style dress that 18th century women wore to costume balls was a perfect choice for a woman known to be fond of social engagements. He associates Mrs. Quincy with the latest fashion and with the activities of her English counterparts, a connection that was designed to flatter her, to win the admiration and envy of her friends, and to bring Copley more business. Copley's portrait of Mercy Otis Warren is also characterized by elegance of attire. Warren, whose name I suspect many of you know, was a playwright, the first historian of the American Revolution, and a dedicated campaigner for the Patriot cause. But when Copley painted her, she was a 36-year-old housewife and mother of 3 sons. Her literary and political career had just begun. Now, she was lucky in her marriage. Her husband, James, encouraged her interests. Nonetheless, she pursued them at some cost, and all her life she was troubled by the conflict between her intellectual ambitions and the behavior colonial society expected of women. She wrote to her friend Abigail Adams, "Whatever delight we may have in the use of the pen, however eager we may be in the pursuit of knowledge, yet heaven has so ordained the lot of female life that every literary attention must give place to family avocations." Accordingly, Copley shows her not as a budding writer and political activist, but as a fashion plate and gracious compliment to her husband. He showed her in profile in a pose designed to show off her dress, which was the latest British fashion. To be portrayed in such a dress, which, by the way, she didn't own, was to claim association with well-born English women such as Susanna Beckford, the wife of the governor of Jamaica. With its expensive silver embroidery and luxurious pleat that gives the wearer the look of an elegant floating pyramid, the dress is perhaps the most expensive outfit worn by any of Copley's clients. It's ironic that Warren would appear in it for her portrait, for in less than a decade, she would become the leader of the homespun movement, which urged the boycott of imported textiles in favor of clothing made from homespun or locally produced cloth. But in the early 1760s, of course, most American women, Mercy Otis Warren no exception, were pleased to be associated with the English aristocracy. Mercy was painted at about the same time as her husband, James, and despite the obvious dissimilarities in pose and setting, the images complement one another. While her pose is designed to show off her dress, it also acknowledges his role as the head of the family. She turns toward him, her head slightly lower than his in the picture plane, while he stands frontally, his walking stick in his hand, his ruddy complexion indicating time spent out of doors surveying his property. Both are portrayed as cultivators and nurturers. He's shown as a country squire, and the vines that trail through her fingers symbolize her role within the family. For in the 18th century, tending the garden, like caring for children, was the exclusive responsibility of women. Within a year or two of the Warren portraits, the political climate in the colonies would change dramatically. The British, suffering from a huge post-war debt and still needing to support an army in America, sought increased revenues from the colonies. Meanwhile, Americans were in the midst of a business decline that made the renewed enforcement of customs a real hardship. The Sugar Act of 1764, with its increased taxes on refined sugar and molasses, was particularly, if you'll pardon me, unpalatable. Yet Copley's portraits rarely express the uneasiness of the age. Rather, as political tensions heightened, his subjects appear comfortable and composed, as though the portraits could guarantee stability and continuity. Material display continued to be of paramount importance. And so it was no small matter when Boston merchants agreed to do without English lace and ruffles, as textiles were the most important British import. This was the first of many boycotts of British goods that would be instituted over the next decade and is reflected in Copley's portraits of leading citizens, such as John Scully. I think you know him. He lives in the Webb Gallery, who is shown wearing plain linen, not lace, at the neck and cuff. Scully sits at a desk with an inkwell, ledger, and documents before him. The landscape behind him is not a representation of his property, but rather an idealized setting that, like the things on his desk, convey a sense of authority and responsibility. Scully, who was a successful 50-year-old merchant when Copley painted him, he was above all responsible. He had been married to his wife, Mercy Greenleaf, for more than 25 years. They had, poor woman, 10 children. One of them, by the way, owned property in the heart of Boston that became known as Scully Square. It's now Government Center. Another married into the Melville family, so Herman Melville, the great 19th century novelist, was Scully's great-grandson. In addition to his business, he was, among other things, a dealer in brass. Scully was extremely civic-minded. Since 1747, he'd served as a fire marshal, which was a serious responsibility, and served on the Board of Selectmen, which was Boston's chief governing body. He soon would be elected chair and serve in that office until his death in 1790. He was politically active. Shortly before Copley painted him in about 1763, Scully was one of the first to sign a petition to the king protesting high taxes. When the Sons of Liberty was organized, Scully joined. Yet he remained a political moderate. Above all, he was known as being fair-minded. At one point in the early 1770s, he interceded with General Washington on behalf of the British in Boston, and his house was ransacked by a mob for his pains. It's his moderation in business and in politics that Copley emphasizes here. His attire is sober and unostentatious. He wears linen, not lace, as I said. His buttons are not silver. The only expensive item in his outfit is his powdered wig. The size of the portrait is modest, too. It's 36 by 28 inches, more or less, it's the smaller and so therefore less expensive of Copley's standard portrait sizes. And in fact, it's a rare example of a merchant's portrait in that smaller size. When Copley painted Men of Affairs, here's James Murray, also done in 1763, he generally showed them at three-quarter length, better to show off their opulent clothes and luxurious surroundings. But when he adopted this formula, and I suspect those of you who know Copley's work have seen lots of pictures in that pose and in that kind of setting, when he adopted that formula to a smaller canvas for his portrait of Scully, he didn't simply shrink the figure. Rather, he showed him at half length, so his head remains large and his body close to the picture plane. As a result, Scully's image is intimate and at the same time intense, and we focus on his expression. Copley makes it clear that Scully is forceful, decisive, conscientious, and engaged with the events of the day. Though it's a bit off topic, I'd like to say a word about the portrait of Scully's wife, whom you see there on the right, unfortunately rather pink. As you've seen with the Warrens, Copley didn't feel obliged to paint husband and wife in matching settings or parallel poses, even when he painted them at roughly the same time, which is the case here. But he treats them in ways that complement one another. His portrait is factual, direct, emphatic. Hers, though no less compelling, is dreamy and kind of romantic. The setting is generalized and unembellished. Even her dress isn't really a dress, but a kind of arrangement of fabric that in portrait conventions of the day was meant to communicate timelessness and so idealize the sitter. Hers is really one of the most sensuous portraits Copley ever painted. His is one of the toughest. His is an archetype of masculinity and business, hers of femininity and perhaps the boudoir. These portraits were painted about 1763, just as England's pressure on the colonies really began to increase. The Sugar Act came in 1764, then the Quartering Act in March 1765, and the Stamp Act in November. The Quartering Act required the colonies to provide housing for the British Army. The Stamp Act was a tax on newspapers, almanacs, legal and commercial documents, and was the first tax imposed on goods produced in the colonies. And there will be a quiz on this at the end of the afternoon. In response, the newly formed Sons of Liberty staged public demonstrations and issued broadsides, such as Paul Revere's print that you see here, that shows a supporter of the Stamp Act. There he is, see if I can do this, hanging from the Liberty Tree. Meanwhile, Copley continued to keep his political opinions to himself. As he wrote to fellow painter Benjamin West, "I am desirous of avoiding every imputation of party spirit, political contests being neither pleasing to an artist nor advantageous to the art itself." And so he continued to seek commissions from both sides. His most important commissions of 1765 were for men deeply involved with the events of the day, but from opposing points of view. Copley used the same pattern, by now familiar, for both portraits. It's an enlargement of the Scully formula, in which the sitter sits at a cloth-draped writing table with quill pen, ready to make notations in a large ledger. John Hancock and Benjamin Hallowell are expensively dressed. Hallowell wears a dove-gray velvet suit of a slightly old-fashioned cut. Hancock, somewhat younger, wears a less formal but more stylish frock coat braided with gold, breeches trimmed with gold buckles, and a costly powdered wig. This is 1765, and Copley by now has established himself as the leading portrait painter in Boston. He was highly sought after for his flattering likenesses that advertised the distinction of his subject. Yet in both of these portraits, I think we can see a certain tension between the image each man wanted to present and his inner life. In 1764, Hallowell had been made controller of the port, a prestigious and lucrative job. As Boston's customs officer, he was charged with collecting Britain's portion of the profitable trade between New England and the West Indies, and he personally directed seizures of property and punitive actions against Bostonians. As his power grew, so did his unpopularity, till in August 1765, an angry mob ransacked his house. An eyewitness report: "After tearing down the fences, breaking the windows, etc., they entered the house and in the most savage and destructive manner broke and abused his furniture, glasses, china, and in short, everything they could lay their hands on." The mob may also have vandalized this portrait. We can see how it would have provoked hostility, for in it, Hallowell gazes at us with an arrogant expression, and Copley puts us in the position of a merchant who must approach Hallowell to pay the resented tax and suffer his rather insolent stare. On the surface, John Hancock's portrait is more benign. Hancock had already developed a reputation as a man of expensive taste and keen fashion sense. He was known about town for his lavender suits and bright yellow carriage, and considered fancy clothes essential to his image. Very un-Bostonian then and now. As he wrote to his uncle and benefactor Thomas Hancock from London, "I dress as genteel as anyone and can't say I am without lace. I endeavor in all my conduct not to exceed your expectations in regard to my expenses, but to appear in character, I am obliged to be pretty expensive. I find money some way or other goes very fast, but I think I can reflect it has been spent with satisfaction." Kind of reminds me of my younger daughter. You give her a nickel, she spends a dime. Now, when Hancock ordered this portrait, he understood that it was a material good, an ornament to be displayed next to the other sumptuous possessions in his Beacon Hill mansion. But he may have hoped as well that it would promote a new, more responsible image. In 1764, his uncle Thomas, there he is at right, another portrait by Copley, Thomas died, and John, then 27, inherited the business empire, the most successful Boston had ever known. The next year, attempting to assume his uncle's role as civic patron, John established the Hancock Professorship at Harvard and donated 1,000 volumes to the library. Also in 1765, he was elected to the Board of Selectmen, his first political office. Hancock presumably intended that Copley's portrait would solidify his image as an eminent businessman, a public servant, and a philanthropist. Yet something about that portrait suggests that Hancock might not yet be entirely adequate to those tasks. His body seems somewhat diminished by that massive ledger and swag of drapery. Unlike Halliwell, whose self-confidence and ambition are undisguised, Hancock wears a bland and distant expression. His arm reaches across the ledger in a way that is more awkward than authoritative. All this aside, the Hancock and Halliwell commissions were extremely opportune for Copley. As Boston grew increasingly politicized, Copley had to his credit images both of the leading Tory and the town's most prominent Whig. Having successfully demonstrated his appeal to both sides, Copley was well positioned to secure more business from each. Thus, in 1767, he was hired by the exceedingly wealthy Loyalists, Nicholas and Thomas Boylston. They were, I think, the Koch brothers of their day. John Adams characterized them as Hotspurs all. But about the same time, Copley painted the radical Whig Jeremiah Lee, who organized his fellow Marbleheaders against the Stamp Act and would represent the town at the Continental Congress. Lee was the equal of the Boylstons in terms of wealth and prestige, reminding us that in the days before the Revolution, there was no correlation between economic status and political allegiance. The wealthy were as likely to be patriots, as loyal to the king, and Copley painted them all. Lee's grand, stylish, even pretentious portrait represents an extreme form of colonial schizophrenia. About 1768, Lee built a mansion in Marblehead, you can tour it today, and he filled it with the most expensive and elegant furnishings money could buy, including a chest of drawers like this one, whose rich mahogany surfaces and elegant shape mark it as a masterpiece of colonial craftsmanship. Yet, when Lee commissioned his portrait, he had Copley insert into his image, or perhaps Copley suggested it, an even grander piece of furniture, a gilt pier table. A table Lee didn't own. In fact, a table that never existed in America. It was a table fit for a queen. And in fact, it was a queen's, and it was copied from this print that you see on the left of Queen Caroline, the wife of George II, the previous monarch. Never mind that associations with British royalty were anathema to Lee's politics. It was the social cachet he was after. Now, while Copley was painting Lee and Boylston, political tensions were ratcheting up yet another notch. In June 1768, Hancock's ship, the Liberty, was seized by the Commissioner of Customs for non-payment of duty. Up till then, Hancock had been a voice for moderation, but he was radicalized by this event. That same year, a non-importation agreement which encouraged the boycott of most British goods was adopted by many leading businessmen. This boycott polarized the merchant class, most of whom were importers, but it also gave increased prominence to local craftsmen, among them Paul Revere. This followed a letter sent by the House of Representatives to the other colonies stating that Massachusetts, attending to defy the Townshend Acts. As you remember, that was the one that had imposed new taxes on imported goods, including lead, paper, glass, and tea. Now, when the royal governor insisted that the House rescind that letter, it was called circular letters, I'm sure you remember that from 8th grade history, 92 of the 109 members of the House refused. It is to them, the glorious 92, and maybe you can even see it written or engraved right here, that Paul Revere's celebrated Liberty Bowl was dedicated. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Revere and Copley were colleagues. Revere provided the cases for a number of Copley's miniatures, and the two served many of the same patrons. Yet, if the images Copley made of himself and his fellow artists at about this time in any way reflect their aspirations, they were clearly moving in opposite directions. In his pastel self-portrait of 1769 on the right, Copley gives no indication of his means of earning a living. Rather, he shows himself in a luxuriously embroidered waistcoat and a blue-green damask dressing gown like those worn by his wealthiest patrons. Copley made this portrait the year he married Susanna Clark, the daughter of a wealthy tea importer, and it reflects the material rewards of career and marriage. Now, for a while, Copley was able to have it both ways. Though he had married into a distinguished Loyalist family and enjoyed the social and professional advantages his new status gave him, he continued to work hard to appear politically neutral. Revere, on the other hand, remained firmly identified with his craft, with the artisan class from which he came, and with his commitment to American liberty. At a moment when the new taxes on tea were strangling the local economy, the teapot that Revere contemplates becomes an emblem of the political trials of the country. Copley, in his imported silks and leisured and formal manner, represents Boston's Anglophilic way of life, soon to come to an end. In contrast, the earnest, thoughtful, hardworking Revere, shown in his work shirt of homegrown cotton, comes to stand for the American of the future, a representative of the values the country would embrace after the Revolution. In October 1768, British troops landed in Boston and marched to Faneuil Hall. As you can imagine, we were not pleased. To appease the citizenry, the king ordered General Thomas Gage to Boston. Though Gage was ultimately unsuccessful in calming things down, Bostonians initially found him both dignified and affable. Copley shows him directing troops through ordinary military maneuvers. The general dominates the foreground and points behind him to a miniaturized landscape on which tiny, non-threatening soldiers drill. The composition is deliberately old-fashioned. Copley adopted it from a famous portrait painted by Robert Feeke 20 years earlier, showing General Samuel Waldo, a hero of the French and Indian War. In so doing, Copley connected Gage with an undisputed hero of an earlier, more harmonious era, an image designed to be conciliatory when all Boston was agitated by the presence of British troops in town. In 1774, Gage was made Royal Governor of Massachusetts. He was good at allaying the king's fears about Bostonians. he wrote to His Majesty. "They will be lions whilst we are lambs, but if we take the resolute part, they will undoubtedly prove very meek." Got that wrong. But he wasn't so successful at deflecting the suspicions and anger of the citizenry. In some measure, his problems may have been compounded by his wife. Margaret Kemble Gage was from one of the most influential families in New Jersey and was also related to Van Rensselaers of New York. She was the first to pose for Copley during the artist's extremely profitable 7-month stay in New York City in 1771. Clearly, there was chemistry between them. The picture that resulted, which Copley called "beyond compare the best lady's portrait I ever drew," is one of the most exotic, seductive, and politically charged paintings of his career. Copley showed Mrs. Gage in fancy dress costume. She wears a square neck gown trimmed with gold braid, her sleeves held up with ropes of pearls, and her hair caught up in a length of green silk fashioned as a turban. The style of her gown evokes so-called Turkish dress, then the rage in England. Her pose is languid and informal. She seems shockingly different from the uptight, upright Boston matrons that Copley had been painting. The portrait, which clearly announced Mrs. Gage's aspirations to British high society, would have been viewed as a compliment to her English husband's position, and possibly even as a declaration of allegiance to the Loyalist cause. It may also have been, in some measure, a disguise, for Mrs. Gage's political sentiments were apparently not always those of her husband. Some historians have hypothesized that she was a spy, suspecting that she passed along to Joseph Warren, there he is on the left, the leader of the colonial militia, secret information about the movement of British troops obtained in the privacy of her husband's bedroom. At the very least, it's obvious that being depicted in attire so closely associated with British high fashion was more politically provocative in 1771 than it had been in 1761, when Copley painted Mrs. Quincy. Meanwhile, the artist himself had come under fire. During the Townshend Act riots of 1769, his portrait of the royal governor had been vandalized, as the press said, its heart cut out, and Copley was called upon to repair the damage. The radical press turned his conservation of the image into a traitorous act. Our American limner, Mr. Copley, by the surprising art of his brush, has actually restored as good a heart as had been taken from it, though upon a near and accurate inspection, it will be found to be no other than a false one. Boston's patriots were clearly putting Copley on notice. As though to redeem himself, when in 1770 he was hired to paint Samuel Adams's portrait, he created an image that was as dramatic, powerful, and politically charged as anything he'd ever done. Copley represented the wily politician Copley represented Adams at what the wily politician would always consider his finest hour, his showdown with Governor Hutchinson after the Boston Massacre. Adams points to the Massachusetts Royal Charter with one hand. In the other, he holds a petition from his aggrieved fellow citizens demanding the expulsion of British troops from the town. The confrontation was both a collision of principles and the culmination of a hostile relationship between two powerful men. Hutchinson saw Adams as, his words, the greatest incendiary in the king's dominion. Adams's fanatical hatred of Hutchinson is obvious from his boastful description of the event. "If fancy deceived me not, I observed his knees to tremble. I saw his face grow pale, and I enjoyed the sight." Copley's portrait makes it clear that the electricity of the moment was bound up with Adams's volatile character. Excuse me. Adams is placed slightly off-center and seems to crowd the table, threatening the viewer's space. His face and hands are spotlit, so they seem to loom out of the dark background. His head is overlarge and so seems all the more commanding. His piercing stare is uncomfortably intense. In this commission, Copley experimented with a new theatrical style. Far more than any other sitter, Adams is commandingly real, terrifyingly present. The portrait illustrated a specific and urgently important historic episode that would have been recognized by anybody who saw it. At the same time, it alluded to larger consequences. Adams's defiant gesture and gaze arrest the viewer, who is addressed as if he were Hutcheson. The charge to Hutcheson was also a charge to the viewer's loyalty, a challenge at once inspiring and threatening. According to tradition, the portrait was commissioned not by Adams himself, but by his partner in political affairs, John Hancock. Hung in Hancock's house, the site of important revolutionary meetings, it must have been extremely persuasive. The portrait became well known. It was copied in oil and reproduced on political broadsides like the one you see on the left, where Adams's glowering expression was paired with inflammatory prose. It became, in fact, an instrument of propaganda, an agent of the revolution. Although the next outbreak of violence did not occur for another few years, with the Boston Massacre and showdown with Hutcheson, battle lines were drawn. Conflagration was inevitable. Copley, of course, did not indicate his reaction to these events, but it became increasingly apparent that his fellow citizens associated him with the Loyalist viewpoint. In November 1773, vandals attacked his father-in-law's house and forced the family into hiding. The next month, in what became known as the Boston Tea Party, several hundred casks of his family's tea were dumped into the harbor. In April of 1774, the increasingly uncontrolled mob threatened Copley himself. Many of the artist's greatest patrons, the Boylstons, the Royals, had by this time fled the country, and those remaining behind had little time or inclination to sit for their portraits. In May of 1774, Copley signed a petition opposing the non-importation agreement and expressing support for the British governor, Governor Hutcheson. He was finally taking a stand with the Loyalists. And on June 10th of that year, he sailed for Europe, never to return. Several years later, Copley was reunited with his family in England, and there you see them, where he successfully pursued a career as a history painter and portraitist, and where he lived as an English gentleman, as presumably he had long dreamed of doing. Yet he continued to have thoughts of home. Shortly after leaving Boston, he wrote of his feelings for America, passionate yet ambivalent. And he one last time sidestepped political commentary in favor of promoting his art. Could anything be more fortunate than the time of my leaving Boston? Poor America, I hope the best, but I fear the worst. Yet certain I am she will finally emerge from her present calamity and become a mighty empire. And it is a pleasing reflection that I shall stand among the first of the artists that shall have led the country to the knowledge and cultivation of the fine arts. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What was the attitude at the time toward crossing that line beyond being inspired by other works and really copying significant elements of established works?
Very different from what it is now. Uniqueness is prized in our society. In Copley's day, if you could be portrayed like Princess Anne, good for you. It really was a very, very different emulation was the idea, not copying. So in fact, there is no record what the three ladies with the same dress thought or whether they even knew about it. But this whole business of borrowing poses and costumes, Copley didn't make it up from British prints. There were artists in Boston before him. They weren't as good at it just in terms of their hand, nor were they as good at matching fashion to the sitter. He was really canny about that. It was no accident that Jeremiah Lee had the Queen's table in his portrait. He was the biggest fish in town. So in fact, it was part of Copley's, his armory of devices that flattered the sitter rather than, as we would feel now, kind of second rate.
Question about intent and interpretation, specifically around the Paul Revere portrait. Obviously, there were different political leanings between the two of them. Would it be something that Paul Revere had asked to be portrayed in terms of his representation in simplicity and looking at the teapot and political intention, or would it be more Copley's intent to portray him in that way?
We have no idea. Unfortunately, there are no primary sources that really describe either the whole process of Copley sitting for a portrait or his working method. He writes some letters that give us some indication, but nothing on that subject. We assume that Copley had a huge repertoire of British prints, so it's like when you go to the hairdresser, you want to change your style, you look through a magazine, you say, okay, let's try this. Whether Copley, put the right pages under the nose of his sitters, as I would assume he did, or whether the sitter came to him and said, I'd like to look like this. I think it was a negotiation, as portraits always are, but we really don't know. The portrait of Revere is one of only two in which he represents someone from the artisan class looking like that. And was that an accident? Was that his suggestion? Was that an expression of the politics and preferences of the sitter? All we know is what we see in these cases, sorry to say.
How could a self-taught artist suddenly emerge as such an accomplished artist and produce such fabulous work? Are there any examples of his early work that would show the progression of how he got to where he suddenly appeared at such a young age?
Let me just... That's one of his first surviving portraits. And if you can think about that next to what he became, you can see that here his colors are flat, the rendering of texture isn't particularly sumptuous, and then, let's see how fast I can go through this to get you somebody who's really gorgeous. That's 10 years. There's a theory we were actually friends of ours, Mark and Fronia and I and my husband were discussing this at dinner last night, that yes, there are people with incredible talent, but the real talent is for practicing. And if you practice and practice and practice, you get good. And Copley practiced and practiced and practiced, and he studied, and there were other portrait painters in town. He learned from them what they knew. He surpassed them quickly because he was talented, but he worked really, really hard at it.
Was there any evidence that Copley was excellent at creating a true likeness rather than something flattering?
What's the difference?
It's all in your emotional reaction, I suspect, to your own portrait, but still.
Well, if you notice, these portraits, even though they do seem really, really real, the people all have a kind of family resemblance. And in part that's true because they were all related to one another. But it also is the case that any artist in his style, not only any portraitist working in a realistic mode, not only works hard to capture what he sees, but brings things with them. You have to assume that the combination of description and flattery was just right, because if he was too good and if you were too pretty, now you'd like it. How can we know? Occasionally there are portraits, well, no, I didn't have Isaac Winslow. There is one sitter in particular who had his portrait painted by Feek, Blackburn, and Copley. And they all look more or less like each other, but Copley's is the one that I think just is the most persuasive. Was it the most realistic? No photographs, no way of knowing. There is no evidence that anyone was ever displeased by their portrait of Copley, which is not the case with a lot of other portrait painters. And Thomas Eakins, famously, people rejected his portraits as much as they liked them. So whatever it was he was good at, whether it was making you look exactly the way you looked, or more likely the way you wanted to look, it worked for him. I want to just make a suggestion if any of you are caught up with this whole issue of revolutionary politics. I'm currently reading a book by Nathaniel Philbrick on Bunker Hill, which I'm enjoying especially because all of these guys are in it. But it paints a picture of the revolution that is, I'm finding it quite sobering, because it reminds us, or it tells us anew, I certainly didn't ever think of it in this way, what a violent and chaotic time it was. So it's a real revelation about the revolution, and it's a good read. So thank you.